This video shows how to install mosaic glass tiles from Oceanside Tile.
So today I'm going to be installing some glass tile from Oceanside. Now this tile is unusual in the fact that this is actually the back of the sheet. The paper is in the front. Most mosaic tiles have a mesh in the back and you apply it to the wall and that's it. For this one, you have to put it on the wall and then take the paper off later. Glass tile, you need a special glass blade. So if you're renting your saw, make sure you get a saw which has a glass blade. Really important when doing this particular glass tile to get the right amount of mud on the wall, but not so much that it squishes through everywhere and you have to spend hours trying to clean it out. I'm just going to put on some markings where I can stop. I'm going to trowel a little bit and do a little bit. So here's where the lines are of the, just put little marks here, not too much because you'll see it. But yeah, so then I know how far I can spread, because I'll probably only do a section about this big at a time. Yeah, it's very important that you use a glass tile mortar, and it has to be white because you can see through the tiles and you don't want to have gray behind your tiles because that won't let as much light through. So we're just going to mix this up. About 10 minutes to sit around and slake. We're ready for action.
What the hell was it?
Introduce the mud to the wall. They're both fairly similar in how much mud it's going to leave on the wall. This is the one I normally use, but I thought I'd bring this one by as well because there's some areas here that are going to be really difficult to get at with the trowel. Like under the windowsill, there's no room to do anything. I've done what looks like a normal job of getting ready to tile a backsplash. I've used a notch trowel, and at this point, in most cases, we would just proceed to put our tile on the wall, and that's it. But with this glass tile, because you can't see through it right now, well you can on the edges, you can totally see through this tile. So if I were to leave those ridges there from my notch trowel, once the tile goes on the wall, most of it would squish away, but you can still see some little lines. Now I'm going to flatten it out so that when we put this tile on the wall, all we see is white behind the tile. So here's where it gets a little bit trickier. You want to leave the same amount, the same thickness everywhere. You don't want it to go thick and thin. So it's a real delicate procedure of just using your notch very, very gently. And you can see it doesn't want to, it wants to leave little holes. See those little holes? We want to avoid those. So I'm going to have to work it for a little bit until I can get rid of those. But I'm using super gentle pressure just to get as flat as we can without seeing any notches. So in the areas, I don't know if you can see, but in the areas where there are little holes, I just add a little bit more. I just measure up to approximately, we're close to near where the bottom of that plug is, and then I'll cut off this at that point. So that just worked out to be 4 inches. So that's probably going to be close to 4 tiles. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, so it's a little bit less. These aren't quite an inch. So now we're going to cut that. You don't want to cut our countertop. So our first tile's on the wall. Okay, so we're just going to place these like that for now. We're going to cut around this, and then I'm going to grab what they call a float, and a float is what you use for grouting, for getting the grout into the cracks. So what we're going to use it for is to pound it in so we're getting good contact with the glass to the thin set. But in the meantime, we're just going to make our cuts around here, and so we're going to just cut. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and that'll give us a pretty good line there. pretty important that you get good contact, because I'll tell you, these little suckers like to fall off the wall. And tomorrow when we grout, we will lose a few. It always happens. Might be a little bit too close to the plug. Yeah, that's just a bit too close to the plug. I mean, you can do it, but you don't want to have any contact between your tile and the edge of the plug, because you could short it out. So what I'm going to have to do is cut these tiles, take off about 3/8 of an inch or so up to the point here. So I really only need a strip of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 taken off. So now I'm going to go down to my saw, cut these, and then place them on. I'm going to have to do the same thing underneath here. You know, always a good thing to do is to check when your tile's there to make sure that your cover plate's going to cover. So there, you can see we're covered on this side, so we're safe. Always just keep this handy. Cut as close as you can. The trickiest part is going to be where we have to get tile underneath these little tabs here, because that's what's going to hold. When we screw it back on, we're going to need something to screw to. So unfortunately, these particular tabs are not the big wide ones, and you also can't go underneath this here, because that is where we're going to screw our cover plate to, here and here. So these holes, you can't cover those, but you have to somehow get enough tile underneath this tab so that you can screw this fixture back onto it. So the cutting around these has to be pretty close. So we've got our wet saw with our special glass blade, and I'm just going to cut through. Cutting tiles always the same no matter what it is. Slow. Don't push it through because it'll jam. So it's nice and slow and steady. I'm cutting around the plug right now, and when you're putting your cut tiles back in, make sure, of course, that they're dry and that you back butter them, because often there's not enough thinset around the area, and you'd rather have a little bit too much for these little single tiles. So I'm pretty generous with my back butter. Some of it will ooze out, and I may have to do a little cleanup tomorrow before I grout, but it's hard to get these in here. So when I'm doing an L cut, I just use my felt pen, a little Sharpie, and that way you'll be able to see it when it hits the wet saw. It won't go off. So once I've got the tile on the wall, in order to make sure that it gets good contact, we use a float basically for grouting. Yeah, so we didn't have good contact there, so that's what happened. They fell off. So we'll just have to, put them back on by hand. One way that you can cut these tiles without using a wet saw is with some nippers. Nippers. And so you just get it on there where you want it, and there you go. Perfect. So these little ones along the top, they're hard to cut on the saw because your fingers just can't hold them. Try and soften the glue so we can take it off and see what it looks like, since we have to do a little bit of straightening, which we always do. And hopefully we'll be able to get this paper off without too many tiles falling off. So after spreading my thin set, smoothing it out, I always like to take a sponge and hit the bottom of the counter to the edge so we don't have a lot of stuff oozing out at the bottom, which is harder to clean later. There we go. Touch up here. So that's how you want your surface to look before you put your tiles on. The tiles had a little bit of a chance to set for a little while. We wet it down every few minutes, and it starts to let the glue separate. So then very carefully, we peel it back, Some areas will come off easily and some you'll pull the tile out. That's just what it is. You just have to fix it if you get lucky. Usually there's a little spot somewhere where it's too tight. Like this one. There we go. It's gotta look, you can tell it looks quite wet when it's ready to go. There we go.
Looks great.
That's what, oops, see that one, that corner wasn't wet enough, so it pulled the tile right off. Because most of the grout joints are very small, I'm going to use 2 parts of the unsanded and 1 part of the sanded. And I always use some kind of a measuring device because you can't, if you ever have to repair something, you want the grout to look the same as it did when you grouted it. Because if you use a different mixture, you'll see the texture looks different. And another part unsanded. So we go 2 to 1. So now we're going to mix it up dry so that we incorporate both the sanded and the unsanded together. If you were doing a larger area, you'd use a paddle and a drill, but I find it's such a small thing, you don't really need it. So I'm going to mix this until it's the consistency of approximately cream of wheat. After we mix this, it gives us a chance to clean out some of the grout joints because you're going to get some joints that the thin set has squished out of, and because the thin set was white and I'm using warm gray, I want to get the lumps out. So this is good. There's the consistency. As you can see, it holds to my tool. So what I need to do now is I need to let this slake. If I use it right away, it'll start to stiffen in about 15-20 minutes. I've mixed the grout and I'm going to give it some time to slake. Now's the perfect time to make sure that any thin set that is squished out between the grout lines is taken out with a utility knife. Be very careful with these knives because they have lines on them where they're meant to be broken off to get a fresh blade, and too much sideways pressure, one will come off without you knowing it. It'll shoot out. Okay, we're ready to grout. You want to make sure that your work surface is pristine, so we just simply use a rubber float. This is the easy part. You also want to make sure that if you have any wooden surfaces that you're up against, that they've been sealed, because if they haven't, this grout will stain it. Make sure it pushes into all the little crevices. You want to hit it in different directions, vertical, horizontal, and diagonal. Make sure that you get really good coverage because you don't want little holes. So now, depending on how fast you're going to work, you might want to just do half the job and then wash it and then do the other half. I've been doing this for some time, so this particular grout doesn't dry super fast, so I will float the whole surface first before I start to wash. The advantage to that is that the grout inside the lines has a chance to dry a little bit. I mean, it'll also dry on the surface, which can be a real pain. If it's too dry on the surface, it's hard to get off. But if you actually start washing it before it starts to dry, then you'll get shallow joints because your sponge will just wash the grout right out of it. So there's a fine line between when to start washing. You have to just sort of test the joint, feel it a little bit, try a little section. If it's still too wet, then wait. But most do-it-yourselfers would be better off doing half and then half. As you can see, I'm trying to get most of the grout off the surface. I don't want it to look like this, I want it to look like this. If I leave too much grout on the surface, it's going to be really hard to clean later. Be careful around some of the plugs because some of those tiles won't be all that well affixed because you don't have a lot of room. You've got small tiles and you don't have much to stick it to. You'll notice that. So just don't press super hard there. If you do, tile falls off, you can always put it back on. Just more work. Now that I've got my grout all floated into the joints, what I like to do is clean off all the edges before I start washing. So I've got this little area ready. I'm using a brand new sponge because I find for grouting, a new sponge doesn't dig into the joints and you get a nice full joint, which is really what you want. So I start off with very light pressure, and what I'm going to do is what they call rough washing. I'm just going to get the majority of the grout off the tile, and later on I'll give it a final wash. So it's just a very even, and let the sponge do the work. Don't be pressing it. Wash your sponge often. So at this point, I finished my rough wash. You can see there's still a haze on the tile, but I've cleaned everything up, and now is the time to change the water, because all that grout is now in that water. It's dirty, so no matter what I do, it's never going to come clean. So I'm going to get a fresh pail of water, and I'm going to make sure I clean my sponge up really well, and then I'm going to do a final wash, which is basically taking off all the haze, and have a coffee, because at this point the grout is setting. It's not going to stick to the surface of the tile because you got most of it off. I mean, there's that haze, but it won't take much to get that off at this point. So it's actually better to let it sit for maybe 15-20 minutes, as long as a half an hour really, because that way the joints get a chance to set a little bit. And so when you're doing your final wash, you're not taking any of the grout out of the joints. Once again, full joints are the key and the goal of our grouting. I've got clean water, clean sponge. At this point, I'm going to go through the little corners with my utility knife, because my margin trowel doesn't get right into the corners, and I'm a bit of a stickler about not having rounded corners. Really important now to use a super dry sponge, like really, look at that, nothing's coming out because I've got it really dry, because a wet sponge will impart water to the grout, and the last thing you want is that grout to have more water on it. So with the clean wash, you're basically taking off the things you missed with the rough, and you're going to do a nice light pressure and let the sponge do the work, turning it often. If I go like this, oh, no, there's still a little bit of grout on there, so it's not quite. But over here, I've got a bit of a haze, so just dry sponge. So there's our finished product. It's all nice and clean, no more haze on the tile. What's left now is to put the cover plates back on to the plugs, and we also have to tighten the plugs onto the tile.